I'm thinking there's a lot to be gained in every one of the steps of the case. It's not just, you're not just moving toward the end, you're not just moving toward the action, but there's something to be gotten every time. And this might be a little harder to see for the description than for some other stages. But
I think
on the way in, I was thinking of at least two things. One is you get better at noticing. You increase your ability to notice and find things. You know, that little discovery. Oh, I didn't see that before. You're going for that because it can give you an opening. I didn't see it's new facts, right, on the situation. But the other one that I hadn't thought of until recently is by practicing this way, you can become one of those teachers who notices things. Think about it from a student's point of view, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who notices that you can't see the blackboard, just to take a very small example, and moves you up front. So I think there's a chance to work at becoming a teacher who notices from a student's point of view.
that we had a guest teacher from East Lansing,
Mm-hmm.
and that was one of the things she said. I pay attention, close attention to my students, to what's going on with them. Pay attention.
And so a big chunk of the description phase of this whole thing is what can you see, what can you hear, what can you sense, and sometimes what do you feel in response to these things. And you know, what kind of raw material do you gather as a person who's paying attention, from which you can make some ideas, some hypotheses, and then move forward to do something.
So it's slightly different from storytelling.
It is very different from storytelling. This is one of the biggest traps in this thing. I've read descriptions in which the intern, in effect, took the position of the omniscient story narrator, right, who knows what everybody thinks and what everybody feels. It's natural activity. We like that. We generate it easily. But it's not a teacher situation. We don't know all of those things. And wrapping everything up into a story does more to conceal the situation from us than it does to reveal it. So there's a different discipline of holding yourself to what you can see and hear.
And read, if you were to say,
Read,
look at their
if it's student
papers.
work,
And
right? Yes,
Mhm.
exactly.
Mhm.
If we think of this as practice for when you're driving home from school, then it's like the equivalent of driving home from school worried about Jane. Right? And you're vexed because you've tried your familiar stuff, right? Your familiar interpretations of things haven't gotten you anywhere. And at some point it pushes you back to saying, what have I really seen and heard? What has been going on here? Not in the interpretive sense, but in the descriptive sense. What are the facts of the case? What did she actually say? How did she actually look, right? How many times has she actually been absent? You push yourself to remember how it actually was.
Recognizing that same description, if you could get a student to write it, may look very different from their perspective for some of the reasons that come out in the hypotheses and later deliberations. So this idea that your perspective on things is, well, it's unique, but it's also very valuable, and the better you get at being able to notice and train your eye and your ear, the better you get at making that perspective that you have as teacher in the classroom, working with students, working with colleagues, making that perspective better, more useful, more valuable.
So what are some of the subtleties of noticing? You know, if we're saying, here, write a description based on what you see and hear and read, what are some of the subtleties that, you know, how might we want them to proceed with this?
I'm not sure this is very subtle, but it's a stance.
Okay.
That's to give up the idea that we can know what's going on in kids' minds by looking at them. It's sort of a natural tendency. And to some extent, we can read body language, we can read face,
Sure.
and so on. And some kids telegraph, right? I mean, they deliberately compose their faces in ways that are intended to send signals.
And it may or may not be what's really going on.
Exactly. For me, the first step is to say, I can't know what's going on in their heads, with their lives, just by looking at them. Mm-hmm. That means that sets off the search for data, then. How could I know something? How could I find out something? That sets it up.
But that doesn't necessarily eliminate from your descriptive repertoire things like body language, things like tone of voice. It actually elevates them in terms of your responsibility to depict those in a certain way so that you can go back and think about them from different angles, if you want to think of it that way. So when a kid says something to you, when a kid says, yeah, right, your initial reaction is, oh, the kid's being sarcastic, but what did you say to elicit that kind of a response? Maybe there's an interplay there that goes beyond just the statement. So there's a lot more going on that by jumping right to the interpretation of kids being sarcastic.
So included in the description is what, not only what you saw in the student, but also what you said and did
Yes.
as the teacher?
You bet. It's an interaction.
Yeah.
So you've got to get both parts.
Which is also...
So if you make yourself the omniscient storyteller,
Yeah.
in a sense you've left yourself out of the description.
Yes.
And that actually brings up another trap, which is you can go the other direction and tell the story about you. And I can say, so I did this, and I did this, and I did this, and the student was, you could say one line about the student, and then the rest of it could be about you. And at that point, you have very little data to go on from what's actually happening in the room. You can talk a lot about what you did.
When we start to describe, we try to sort of step over to the corner, up into the far corner of the room, and talk about this as though we were watching ourselves, so that we can. That's one of the chief purposes of description: to catch ourselves doing stuff we hadn't noticed. Often we're implicated in the situation with a kid, and the only way to catch ourselves is to get better at noticing what we do. That's a descriptive problem.
Right.
Now, we don't want to make people think that there's no place for the thoughts and feelings they had at the time. The interpretation I made at the time, right? If John does X and I say John's a jerk, which is an interpretation and an evaluation,
Yeah.
those are the case, right? Because that was happening at the time. Those are facts of the case. And it could be an important fact because I've used this category, jerk, right? Rather than he's afraid. He doesn't think he can do the job, right? But that I had that thought at the time is a fact and goes in the description. And it may be
Especially if there's more to it that continues and there's some action that you as the teacher take in that situation as an explanatory for why did I choose to just say, get out in the hallway, you know? And had I done something differently, or had I interpreted things differently, or had I not used that kind of knee-jerk reaction as a basis for my action, things may have played out differently and could in the future play out differently.
Which takes us back to what has actually happened over a period of months or weeks or the last few days because something has become acute. What really happened? You've jumped to a conclusion already, and now you're going back and you're saying, no, let's check this out.
Right.
And
Let's suspend
Right.
the judgment,
So
if possible.
in the motivation, you could say something like, this kid has been behaving so badly. Or, I haven't noticed this kid at all for weeks. Then when you step back to the description, you're trying to say, what really happened?
What's really going on in this situation?
Well, we can push ourselves to gather the other evidence. What are they doing? And go for data description, contrary to what you started with. But people can do that.
Certainly. And this is where having other folks to help you can be a really powerful, potent tool.
Mentor teachers are the most available person to do that.
Sure, absolutely.
Watch how I interact with Juan, or if you would please, for the next 3 days, and
Collect data.
tell me what you're seeing, what you are seeing, and help you collect data.
That's still part of the description?
Yes.
Okay.
And you can involve the mentor in the subsequent steps, but what we're still trying to work on is what's
going
happening
on
here.
here?
Right? We'll go on to why, right? But first, it's just what. What has happened?